Hello, Kenzie. How are you?
Good morning. Hello. Morning for me. Apologies.
Oh, would you shortly introduce yourself for everybody,
Yeah,
please?
certainly. Hello, my name is Kenzie Woodbridge. My pronouns are they and them. And I work at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. I work in the IT department. I do primarily documentation and training for our faculty and staff, and documentation for our entire community, including our 45,000 students and 3,000 faculty and staff. And I also want to just quickly acknowledge that I am coming to you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, particularly Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh. That's a thing that we are now doing a lot in Canada for very good reason. So I just didn't want to miss out on having done that.
Thank you for this nice little introduction. We will start the presentation now, I think, if there's nothing more to say.
Today, I want to tell you about a dream. Don't worry, I'm not talking about some nonsense that your brain makes up in the middle of the night. No, the dream that I'm talking about is this one, that documentation will be great. It will solve all of our problems. Maybe. It's worth a try anyway, because when you need it and you find the piece of documentation that solves your problem, it is great. But documentation is only great when it is current, accurate, and relevant. And sometimes it isn't, which is actually the problem. Before I get too far into this, I'm just going to define the terms that are central to this talk. So here's my favorite definition of documentation. What is it? It is the life-changing magic of actually writing things down. But more practically, for today's talk, when I say documentation, my meaning is very broad. I'm including developer documentation, user documentation, manuals, code samples, etc., etc. Basically anything we're writing down to help us, our colleagues, our users' customers, at some point in the future. It's all docs for our purposes. Likewise, what is long-term maintenance? Well, it's all the things that we do to keep our documentation accurate, relevant, and current over the long term. So far so good. But next, this is the part where I have to tell you something challenging. Be warned, this may be hard to hear. You may wish to have an emotional support animal available. I mean, hey, there's at least one advantage to online conferences. Ready? Technology won't save us. Now, I know that we, as tech people, we are constantly vulnerable to this idea. There will be a tool or a program or a script and it will solve all of our problems, but it just won't, unfortunately. Technological solutions can help. They are very important. But when it comes down to maintenance, it will always come back to people. I'm so sorry. So, yeah, here's my plan for this talk. We've already done the introductions and definitions. I have crushed your hopes and dreams. Okay, good. I can cross that off. The next thing I'm going to do is establish what criteria I'll be using to evaluate the strategies and practices I'll be talking about. After which we'll dive into talking about the practices and strategies themselves, which will take the majority of our time. By the end, through that exploration, I hope to have restored your optimism and enthusiasm and have given you some useful next steps for improving your long-term docs maintenance. Okay, so how do we know that a docs maintenance strategy is good? So the number one criteria, in order for something to be good, it has to work for the people who are using it. And this might seem very obvious, but I mean it really has to work for those people. It can't just work for a completely different team than the one you have. It can't just work for a better version of that team, people who have more time to devote to it, who have a different skill set, or who simply try harder because there's no trying harder and there's no better version. These are the people you have. It has to work for them. I honestly think this is the most critical piece for success, radical acceptance of who we are and what we are capable of, and creating a system that matches that. Okay. Number 2, it also has to do the thing that it's supposed to do. It has to ensure that your documentation remains accurate, relevant, and current over time. That's very obvious, but if it doesn't do that, it's not a good strategy. Number 3, it has to be self-sustaining, meaning it has to encourage its own use over time. What that can mean will always tie back to number 1 in part, because what ends up being self-sustaining will be different depending on the people you have. Some people will be more attracted to certain options than others. The easiest way to encourage people to keep doing a long-term maintenance strategy is to ensure that it pays them an immediate benefit as well as a long-term benefit. We tend to be a little more callous about the problems we're causing for ourselves and our colleagues in the distant future than we are about the problems we're facing in the here and now. So that's one way to get at it. Number 4, it also needs to fit all of your budgets. But I'm not just talking about money here. It can't cost more money than you have, but it also has to fit in the time that people have available in which to do the work. It has to fit in the amount of attention that anyone is able to pay. It can't negatively affect your performance budget, and so on. Finally, number 5, it should be forward-thinking and it should be able to scale as needed. It helps to know where you're going when evaluating a strategy for your project. If you're small now and you'll be small forever, you can get away with using a strategy that doesn't work at a large scale because you're not planning to go there. But if you are planning for your project to get larger over time, your maintenance strategies need to anticipate that. Otherwise, you'll just end up with a mess. So these are the criteria we're going to use today, and I'll be marking the list of strategies with these icons as we go. Onward, we're going to talk about the strategies and practices themselves. And I'm going to start with practices and strategies that you can use when you're creating or working on your documentation or on the product itself that will support maintenance of your documentation over time. These aren't necessarily specifically the task of maintaining it. These are things that make that maintenance easier. So first, let's talk about self-documenting code. First of all, what is self-documenting code? Well, this ain't it, Chief. At its most basic, when you're writing your code, you're writing it so that it is human readable. Ideally, someone who has a basic understanding of the programming language you're using can follow what's happening in your code because your function names and your variable names and so on are descriptive enough to make it all clear. So what are the pros of this approach? Well, it does make your code base more maintainable and it saves potentially lots of future development time that a person might otherwise need to spend rummaging around the code until they figure it out. It's a lot easier to search for a variable or function across your code base if it has a more descriptive name than if you're using like single letters or something like that. Additionally, in my experience, it inspires a great deal of enthusiasm and pride for the people who are really into their self-documenting code. So it is self-sustaining for them. When you change the code, your so-called documentation, and I'm maybe tipping my hand a little there, is also changed. So outdated info will be very unlikely in the system. But cons, it's not really a thing though, right? Like, I know we call it self-documenting code, but if it is documentation of a kind, and my definition is broad, so sure, it is, it's a very limited kind. It only fulfills a very small part of our documentation needs. It doesn't pull the bigger story together. Just because you know what a variable is, what it's being used for, what a function will supposedly do, that doesn't necessarily tell you about the impact of changes you're making, or, you know, if you do something here, is it going to change something over there? It's not that kind of documentation. It also doesn't tell you what the intent was. It doesn't tell you what future potential additions were contemplated and planned for. And perhaps most importantly, it's not usable by anyone other than the people who are looking at the code, which is a very small proportion of the people. So then some of you would be saying, okay, fine. Well, you do that, but you comment things well, right? And okay, that can help fill some of the gaps I just mentioned. Again, you still have some of those problems. As a practical matter, it is usually a lot easier to get people to continue using your descriptively named variables and functions, and maybe even to get them to name their variables in a similarly descriptive way, than it is to get everybody to write consistently high quality code comments every single time, every single place they're needed, or to update existing code comments when a change is made in the code. So the quality of code comments as documentation can be variable because even the most excellent individual humans don't necessarily do it that well when they're busy or rushed or distracted. And finally, when you don't know the code well at all, or when you know it too well, you might not even understand how to write the kind of comments that other people need. So none of that critique is to suggest you shouldn't do these and other things to make your code more understandable and easier to navigate and document. In fact, rather than get bogged down in the debate, let's just call this one write good code. It is useful, it does help. Next, consider using a structured content approach when creating your documentation. Structured content means breaking your content into the smallest reasonable semantic pieces like title, description, procedure, etc. Think of it as an XML schema, which in many ways it is, and often is, actually. And then using those pieces to build your documentation. It has a bunch of pros. Duplication and inconsistency are unlikely because you're single sourcing and reusing things, and that's good. That eliminates that duplication problem. The holistic view of your documentation is built into it. It's what you've done from the beginning. It's easier to update over time. It scales well because if you put in the time at the beginning to create a good schema, that structure supports everything that you then add from then on. Cons is, of course, that it is very intentionally something that adds complexity. Good structured content tools that you can use to combine and recombine content are themselves complex tools. They may be harder to integrate with your code base, and any separation there can always be dangerous. And it can be very daunting for inexperienced writers or developers. I find that not everyone's brain works in this way, breaks things down into these pieces in this way. But even if you don't go full-on structured content, incorporating structured content principles into your documentation to any extent can definitely support maintenance over time. Another one, then, automatic documentation generation. So that's where you have your code and the documentation for it is in some way integrated right into the code, usually written as maybe code comments. And it's written in such a way that you can run a generator that will then pull it out into documentation form. You can create relational diagrams and all sorts of things automatically. There's all sorts of creative solutions that people have come up with. So what are the pros? Well, it's so much fun. If you're a developer, you may well love it, and you'll talk about how great it is and how no one ever has to update the documentation separately ever again because you have this great tool. And so it is self-sustaining for those people. It's easy to update because you can just regenerate the documentation. You compile it when you compile your code. And if you are pulling your code samples directly out of the code, your code samples are likely to actually work, which would be exciting for some kinds of documentation. Cons, of course, the quality can be quite variable because it again requires people to very, very assiduously do all the right things when they're updating the code. Linters and things can help with that, but there's definitely a learning curve. Certain types of gaps are inevitable because your documentation will be very specific to the code that you're looking at when you're creating it. So you'll be missing those broader, how do all the things interrelate? What does it all mean? Why? Those sorts of parts of documentation. But as with structured content, automatic documentation generation can be a very useful part of your documentation strategy. You may be sensing a theme. Yeah. The next one is really more of a social than a technological strategy or practice, and I really struggled to name it. I eventually decided on contributor consensus. What I mean by this is agreement across your docs contributors about what your overall documentation strategy is, what it includes, what your values are, what your standards are, and especially where it lives, how it will be published, who can add to it. This is something you notice more in its absence than in its presence. If you do have it, you might not even notice you have it. If you don't have it, there are recognizable patterns of problems that you're going to see. Specifically, you'll find people not knowing about your documentation, starting up their own little repositories. There's a wiki over here. We've got an instance of Confluence over there. We have a bunch of Word files on someone's desktop to be emailed in response to queries, etc., etc. Your docs quality will be incredibly variable. You'll see mixed messages from leadership about documentation. The people who are most concerned with the documentation will become increasingly stressed out sheepdogs running themselves ragged, trying to corral all the chaotic sheep. When building consensus around docs, include as many potential contributors in that consensus building as possible. Include formal and informal leaders. This is where something called influence mapping can be of assistance. Include developers, include support folks, and just know also that this consensus is itself something that needs to be maintained over time by appreciating what people bring, by incorporating feedback, all the things we do to maintain consensus everywhere else in our lives. It can't be negotiated once and then that's it. But if you can manage it, this one helps a lot because you can correct a lot of those problems. It's going to be less scattered. It's going to be easier to sustain. You're more likely to stay within budget because, you're not having to do so much chasing around. And, research is pretty clear that diversity of contributor to almost anything will improve outcomes, make better solutions. So even though it can be frustrating to try and build that consensus, it can really pay dividends to try and make that happen. But of course, the con is these are people. It's hard to please everyone. Rebellion occurs unpredictably. You think you got it locked down. You think you got everybody on the same page, and something happens and you don't anymore. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but it's very valuable if you can make it happen. Here's another one. Here's another good one. This is good records. You need good record keeping. Keeping good records of your documentation resources is critical, and it can backfill other weaknesses in your system. So, for example, where I work, our documentation is all recorded in one place. We have a central repository of information, metadata, about our documentation. The documentation itself is stored and served in a bunch of different places because, boy howdy, do we struggle with the consensus one I just talked about. But we can pull those things together and at least keep it a little more organized using our record keeping. We keep a record of every single resource in our ITSM tool. And here's a sample of that. So as you can see, each resource has a unique identifier, a content owner. It has something called a review date and a review cycle. And so on. And I'll talk a bit more about that in another part. But we keep these records so we know where all the things are. What are the pros to good records? Well, you know what you have, which is very useful. It is easier for you to identify your duplications and gaps and to plan for major updates. For example, for a variety of reasons, we recently needed to change how everyone at BCIT, where I work, that's 45,000 students, 3,000 faculty and staff, we needed to change how they logged into every single system. This is the first change to logins that we've had to implement in almost 20 years, which means we had become pretty casual and unconcerned about repeatedly telling users how to log in to our systems all over the place. Log in with your BCIT ID and password, repeated with variations across our public website and throughout our public knowledge base. Having good records made it a lot easier to know what to include when compiling the list of needed changes, and a lot easier to track what changes we were making. 98 knowledge base articles and 150 pages on the website, in case you're curious. Anyway, so records can be invaluable and save you a lot of time and effort. But cons, record are just one more thing to maintain. And record keeping, in my experience, is the easiest thing for people to drop the minute things get busy. It is very easy for people to not want to do it. And it is a thing that definitely tends to reward you more in the long term than in the short term. So it is not as self-sustaining, but still highly recommended. It can be a very important part of your maintenance strategy. So here's another one, no biggie. Let's just have a dedicated documentation strategist or documentation team who is integrated with your dev team. They are working alongside them day in, day out. They're participating in scrums. They're, all of those things. And if you really want to support your long-term maintenance of your documentation, how about we also have the docs environment or processes that are integrated with your dev processes. Pros, well, you're going to have people whose job it is to have that good holistic overall view of the documentation, and they'll have enough information to know how to make good plans, They can address these sorts of things, the gaps, duplications, outdated info. They can support your developers, support your user support team. They support your users. And cons, well, you have to pay them. And you have to be able to make space for them in those team environments, which can be harder, especially for small-scale operations. To have a dedicated strategist for your docs would be pretty tricky. Still, it can be very useful if you can do it. So those were practices that support docs maintenance. Now let's talk about some actual maintenance strategies. I'm going to start with some strategies that can work for small scale, small budget situations, in addition to larger ones, but you can start small with these ones. First, let's talk about what I like to call, let's go and review all the docs. This is basically a content audit. So from time to time, some lucky person gets to go and find all the things and look at them in a skillful way. Pros first, you absolutely can get your good holistic view of the documentation when you do this. It's easy to identify gaps, duplications, outdated content because, yes, you're looking at all of it all at once. But there are problems. In my experience, the main one, the most important one, it does not scale. It does not scale, right? If you have 20 documents, it's fine. If you have 600, well, it's rarely going to happen, right? Because it's going to be interrupted. It's going to be not finished. It's going to be very hard to prioritize. If you have 10,000 pieces of documentation, you're never going to get through this. If you have 400,000, which is a number I have actually heard at a telecom company for their customers, How could anyone? It's impossible. So that's a really big problem, okay? In my experience, as a result, everyone loves it until suddenly they don't love it, and it just falls apart on them. I'll come back to talking about how it could still be useful, however, and how it can work on the small scale, but let's just put a pin in it for now. I don't totally recommend this as a standalone strategy. For those reasons. Next, we have what I'm going to call user-triggered review/update. This is particularly good for your small open source project that you're running off the side of your desk or what have you, where you don't have a ton of resources. You just give the users of your documentation the opportunity to tell you if there's a problem, and you provide them a way to request anything that they're missing. So, for example, every resource that we have available has a link to report a problem with this article. The pros to this is you're never going to waste work, right? You're never maintaining documentation that isn't being used because, people are actually using it. They're using it because they told you there was a problem, they requested it. It really protects you from the possibility that you might waste your own time or effort in maintaining something that no one's using. It really helps to prioritize your efforts if you have a very small budget for time and attention, and it can be cheap or free depending on how you value your own time. On the con side, this strategy doesn't even care about that holistic view of all your documentation. As regards gaps or duplications, if they're spotted, it's by accident. Also, while it can be useful at any scale, it doesn't really scale as a primary or solitary maintenance strategy. For example, if you're working for that big telecom company and you have 400,000 help documents in your knowledge base and you're receiving dozens or hundreds of reports per day, that's a person's full-time job, just looking at reported problems. And that's all they're doing. They're not gaining any of the other benefits of having someone to be a documentarian, a technical writer, to have a strategic view at any of it. It's just, can't be the only thing when you're at that scale. But it can be very useful on any scale as a part of what you are doing. About another thing we could talk about is metrics-directed review. For this, you need metrics of some kind relating to your documentation, like website page views, search history, support call resolution linkages, whatever you can get your hands on. And then let's say you have 15 to 30 minutes to spend on improving documentation. Well, what do you want to do? Here's a Google Analytics report for our public-facing knowledge base. And I've looked at a lot of these over the years, and I can tell you that this is what you're seeing here is a really common pattern in page views. A few resources, it changes over time but a few of them will get a lot of hits, but the numbers go down pretty dramatically after that. I'll just add some percentages, so that's what percentage of the overall page views we're talking about. And let's do a little bit of math with these. So one of the top things here, the third one down, that's actually our homepage. So if you glance at your homepage and you review, update, improve the top 3 resources on that list, you today have addressed 33.6%, a full third of user attention, right? User interest, the things that people are used to, you've addressed a third of it just by looking at those 4 things, which is a pretty good use of your time. And there's other kinds of ways you can let the metrics direct your review. Something that some people do is they look also at the things that are the least viewed and retire them, or at least hide them. Because if there's a resource and people aren't using it, aren't needing it, aren't searching for it, well, you don't have to worry about those things getting outdated. You don't need to worry about them sitting around cluttering the place up. However, I recommend caution with this, and make sure you understand your analytics before you act on it, because, in this example that you see here, some of these aren't even our actual links. These are broken links. These are URLs with typos. They get reported as page views, but that doesn't mean they're actual page views. And your Google Analytics or what have you is never going to show you the articles that never get any views at all, because they don't get any views. They don't get reported. Still, it can be a useful exercise, as long as you make sure you know what you're doing. You can also look at what are the most common search terms. And when people are searching for those things, are they finding the resource that you want them to find? Are they clicking most commonly on the thing that you would actually want them to click on? The best documentation in the world is useless if nobody can find it when they need it, right? Lastly, here's one of my favorite little reports out of my search reporting is, what are people searching for that they're not finding? And this kind of list can be very useful. You might find that you have resources that they should be finding when they search for those terms and they're not. You might need to add some keywords somewhere, or add in an alternate spelling somewhere or something like that, just to make sure it ends up providing a result for people. And if you have control over your search tool, you can sometimes get it to manually prioritize certain types of content, but you don't get to do that with Google. So you want to make sure your search engine optimization is good. So I think the pros of this whole approach are pretty obvious. Letting the metrics direct your maintenance work helps you prioritize your effort by user need. It's very, very efficient, and it can absolutely be used at any scale. Cons? Well, of course, this is very specifically not a holistic view of your docs, and it doesn't help you find duplications, incorrect or outdated information. And if you do decide to delete things, you are deliberately creating gaps, potentially. This strategy serves a purpose, but it doesn't serve every purpose, right? So that's some of the lighter weight strategies. There's 2 more that I'm going to talk about that I think will work a lot better for people who are trying to maintain documentation on a larger scale, sometimes with a larger budget. The first is what I'm going to call scheduled enforced review. What I mean by that is that all resources are scheduled to be periodically looked at by a human to confirm that they're still correct, current, relevant, and so on. I'll also admit my biases to you here. For certain types of documentation situations, I'm actually not convinced that you can realistically succeed at maintenance without doing something along these lines. This is not the same as the let's review all the docs strategy I mentioned earlier. In this case, the review would be centered on either a single resource or a smallish subset of resources. The scheduled review would ideally be relatively lightweight. Is this thing still good? Yes or no? And this is where I'm going to tell you about our system of regular scheduled review. Not because it's perfect, it isn't, but because I think it demonstrates both the advantages and challenges of this strategy. As I mentioned earlier, we have pretty good records of our documentation resources, with each resource having an identified owner. I also mentioned it has a review cycle. That's the period of time after which it must be reviewed. Some resources get reviewed every 3 months, every 6 months, every 9 months, every year. Nothing is allowed to be reviewed less frequently than once a year. And when it comes time for people to be reviewed, they will be notified. In our case, our ITSM tool assigns the content owner a task, like this one, that shows up with all their other incidents and problems and service requests. So in the queue, they're already supposedly checking every day. And the task tells them what and where the resource is and some basic instructions on how to review and close the task. And of course, because we have good records and it's all done within this system, we can easily generate statistics about how we're doing with our review tasks, like these. And that visibility is very useful. I can look at this and I can feel confident that around 80% of our documentation is very likely to be correct, current, still relevant, unlikely to be duplications, and so on. For the record, I'd ideally like to see that 21% number, which is the percentage past the review date, a little lower, more in the range of 5 to 10%, but we're catching up with our backlog, and I'm confident we'll get back to there. We've been there before. And that's where the enforcement part comes in. It's not enough to just schedule it. Because like a lot of ongoing operational maintenance tasks, it's easy to end up prioritizing more urgent work, more interesting work, we're only human, and so on. And technology can only do so much to mitigate that human tendency to put off this kind of thing. As a story, back in 2011, I went from being a contributor to being the knowledge manager, and I was taking over the post from the previous person who hadn't been supported to be effectively doing this, meaning it had basically been very seriously neglected. I had to go through and correct records. Our record keeping was a mess to represent and figure out what we actually had in our repositories, which dropped the total then from 600 that it said we had to the 380 that actually existed. At which point, and that took about 3 or 4 months, at which point I could see that the percent past review was actually around 70%, 30% reviewed, which isn't great and is less great if you understand that those 30% were the resources owned by myself and one other person. Nobody else was doing regular review, even when prompted, and there were resources that hadn't been looked at in years. There were some flaws and brokenness in our record keeping and review notification systems. We worked to correct that. It helped a little, but not that much. It got us from 30% reviewed to 45%, because this is fundamentally a human problem. It's a culture problem. It is not a technological problem. I realized I needed to change my approach. I had been sort of, asking it as a favor, maybe begging and pleading a bit, and that just honestly doesn't work. But I realized that what I needed to do was actually just expect people to do their job. This was an expectation that was present, that we all knew about, and I had to try and figure out how to enculturate that. The way I did that was that I started just by sending people an initial message if they had articles that needed to be reviewed, saying, hey, so I know you've got these 7 articles. They haven't been reviewed. Can you please take a look at them in the next couple of weeks and let me know what's going on? And they wouldn't do anything. And then about a month later, I would send them a second email, including the previous one, and say, hey, just following up on my previous message, can you give me an update? How can I support you? And on this one, I'm CCing their manager. I'm very polite, I'm kind, but I'm expecting them to do their job, because if you respect someone, that's what you would expect of them, that they would do their job, right? Because that's what they would do. Well, and that provoked some resentment in some cases, but it also did get some movement on review. So then I would send a third message after another month in a similar tone of polite inquiry, and I CC'd their manager and also our CIO. My friend, by the way, calls this corporate carpet bombing. So the first year I was unpopular with some, I admit, but that's okay. I also have friends outside of work. I survived it. But it got things moving. The second year, when I sent out the first email, I got a bit more of a response. I had a lot fewer second emails to send, and when I sent them, I got suddenly flooded with people reviewing their things. Very few third emails. The third year, I was starting to send my first emails, and before I had gotten very far down the list, I started getting people I hadn't yet contacted reviewing their articles, because word got round that, oh no, Kenzie's doing the thing again, quick! And then it became a point of pride for people, not to get that first message because they were already up to date. And it also motivated the people who had just been sort of squatting as content owners. They'd maybe moved on to different roles. This didn't have anything to do with their day-to-day life, but they hadn't bothered to update the record. So they would report, hey, can you just reassign this? And then I could give it to someone who would actually review it, and so on. And I recognize that culture change taking place over years is a luxury that not everyone can indulge in. But my point is that culture change is possible. It took persistence and enforcement, and it took a willingness to be unpopular. But it paid results for us, and maybe it can for you too. That was a bit of a lengthy digression, so let's wrap this up. The pros, if successful, your outdated documentation will be rare or short-lived because you will identify it within a period of time and get rid of it or update it. Especially if you apply this to not just individual resources, but to small subsets of resources, you can identify gaps and duplications, which then empowers you to eliminate and fix them. By comparison with the content audit version of reviewing all the things, the workload is manageable over time because no one is ever sitting down and having to review 600 things at once. Of course, cons, not going to sugarcoat it, it does require support and enforcement from, I recommend, kind, firm, and persistent human beings. It really helps, again, if you have that contributor consensus piece I spoke about earlier, and it is very much reliant on your good records, which, if you haven't managed to maintain, can be another problem. And that support, enforcement, record keeping is potentially costly. But for all that, I highly recommend figuring out how to incorporate some aspect of this strategy into whatever your situation is. The final strategy I'm going to talk about is the grand unified theory of everything. Or maybe it would be better to say the grand unified theory of docs maintenance, where you basically combine a whole bunch of these things, which you might do in stages. You might start with metrics-directed review to take immediate advantage of its efficiencies and its direct connection to what users are seeking. If you don't have metrics available, or if you don't have good records, that's the best use case for actually doing a content audit. Right? I said there's a place and a time for that. So content audit out of which you could start your record keeping, which you need in order to add scheduled enforced review, which would probably be a lot easier to implement if your docs team is better integrated with your dev team, which could also provide opportunities to more systematically write better code, which in turn would likely make it a bit easier for you to incorporate some amount of automatic documentation generation where that makes sense to do, and so on. I'm sure you see my point. Sometimes complexity is inevitable and necessary. We're all right now living through a situation which illustrates pretty clearly the idea that there's no ultimate single solution that will save us. To stop the spread of COVID-19 and prevent millions more needless deaths, we need to wear masks, socially distance, and limit large public gatherings, as we are doing today, and ensure that absolutely everyone who can be safely vaccinated has access to vaccination in every country on the planet, regardless of the local economy. And doing only one or two of those things doesn't get us where we need to be. I admit, okay? I said that. That's pretty heavy suddenly. The problem of long-term documentation maintenance, it's not anywhere near the pandemic in the scale of importance. But then nothing is. And if I don't get to come to see you all in Germany, which I'm very sad about, I at least get to use the best example there has ever been for what I'm talking about. Combining multiple strategies is effective because they can reinforce each other. They reward use. They backfill the deficiencies of other strategies. If you can get into a groove with long-term maintenance and stop playing constant catch-up, you can build on that success. It's impossible to do really strategic work with documentation when you're constantly worried about cleaning up a mess. But if you've cleaned up the mess, then you can actually do some really interesting creative things to make things actually better. So not all complexity is bad. and engaging with complexity is often rewarding. So, there you go. That's a bunch of practices and strategies that you might want to consider adding to your repertoire. So where does that leave us? Right. Final thoughts, and then I'll leave it to you to decide if I have, in fact, restored your optimism and hope for the future. In addition to that list of strategies, here's what I hope you can take away from all of that. Scale and resources are important when you're considering what to do. But there are plenty of things to choose from, and you should just start now with what and who you have and from where you are. Something is better than nothing. And then just keep going. And good luck. So there you go. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope I have not wasted it. And yes, you can absolutely have access to these slides. They are at bit.ly/docsmaint4accento, all one word. And additionally, if you're looking at all of that and you're going, okay, but how do I even get started? Or I want to know more about one of those things. I have also collected together all of the research that I did in talking about this, all of the research I've done over the years as a person who does this for a living. And you can have access to that too. It is at bit.ly/docsmaintnotes, all one word. And you can even suggest adding new things to that document, and I encourage you to do so. I also want to learn from you. Thank you again. Have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you for this nice talk about documentation. Let's go review all the docs. Have to happen at once, or would it be okay and more realistic to stretch this out over weeks or months or years? Is this even possible?
Right. And I think the difference between those things, if the purpose of that, let's go review all the docs, is to take a look at a snapshot of what it is. And if you stretch it out over weeks, months, years, the longer you stretch it out, the more the things you looked at first will potentially have changed, will potentially have fallen out of date, and so on. I think what Nikolai is really describing is really the more scheduled, regular review of, some smaller portion of it over time, rather than the full content audit. But a full content audit is a content audit. If you stretch it out, you're losing at least some of the advantages of it, of that whole holistic view of the whole thing all at once.
Okay. There's also another question. I'm not sure if we can really answer that, because there's the question about a documentation system from a company seems like to call DVO. Do you have any context about this? What do you think about it, if you know it?
I've never read this one, although okay. I do see that they do have the grand unified theory of documentation as the big quote on the page. I'll be honest, I haven't read anything about this specific one. I look forward to looking at it though. So yeah, I can't offer anything.
Do you have any kind of other documentation systems you can recommend? Are there open source alternatives when you say now we have documentation, we have not think about all of this kind of things? Do you have recommendations of systems to use where you have experience with?
Yeah. So there's a system called Read the Docs, which is open source. It's an open source documentation project out of a group in Portland who then created a conference, which I also recommend, called Write the Docs. It's an amazing conference. But that's a tool I'm very limited in what I can use in my own workplace, basically. Lots and lots of people, this is not news to anyone, use Confluence to manage their documentation. And, there's a lot of advantages to it, but there are also disadvantages. And because it's a technological solution that, ties in with so many of our other technological solutions, like it talks really well with Jira and, Git and all the things, there's a tendency for it to be launched without the application of the skills of a documentarian or someone who's going to do the work of figuring out like ontologies and, taxonomies and things like that to understand how you're going to organize it. Documentation is fundamentally a thing that needs a human eye to it at some point in the process. And if you were to launch a Confluence thing, I highly recommend trying to get that technical writer, even if it's just a consultant that you hire for a few hours, to get someone in to take a look at that before you launch it. It'll save you a lot of effort fixing things later on. I know Knowledge Owl has a pretty solid tool as well. That one's not open source. It's a commercial product, but there's that. Honestly, what we use WordPress, which is also our CMS for the whole of our public website. But, really, it's not the tool that matters so much as it is the thought behind the scenes of how are you going to organize your information? What is your overall strategy for, who is your audience for this set of documentation? What is the purpose that you're trying to solve in giving them this documentation? If you know those things, if you know what you're trying to do before you do it, it's not the tool that matters. It's having those guiding principles in place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. You also mentioned something quite interesting and important. I think the organizational part. So documentation, I see it as a living thing. So sometimes people are really centered about how everything is ordered in the documentation. So it's not about writing the documentation, but putting the documentation into the right context and places. What is a recommended way for doing reordering of documentation? Because I feel sometimes, also often, a project or something realizes, our documentation might not fit actually the user need, but the developer need, which is not really reading the documentation, and then you need to start reordering. How would you recommend to start such a process? Would you really say, let's review all the docs and then do the reordering, or what would be a recommended way to start with that?
I think this might seem paradoxical, but the less you have a very tightly imposed, static structure on your documentation, the more you rely on things like categories, tags, and things like that to curate your content, the easier it is going to be in the future to make a change. If you start with this project and it evolves into something different, and now your documentation doesn't quite match, how you want it to be. If you have left yourself that flexibility to reorganize it without having to change every URL, for example, I know in Confluence, if you use a sort of, it's not a directory structure, but you know what I mean? You end up with URLs that now, if you don't want it to have that thing, now every URL has to change. And that can be a bit of a mess, because you might have those in all sorts of places. You might have them not just in this one system, but, they might be, if you're developing your tools well, they have direct links into your documentation, right? So you might have to change all the links there. The more you can sort of divorce the way you're serving the thing from the very specific structure, while still having the ability to impose a structure in the way you display and organize it, the better, if that makes any sense.
Makes
yeah.
total sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also another question in the chat. Are there any specific features of a knowledge management system you think make maintenance easier?
Well, building on what I just said, if you have the ability to, if it sort of has built in already those category tag curation types of things, if that's something that's built into it, then that makes it a lot easier. The way that we're using WordPress is not default WordPress, but WordPress has the concept of tags and categories. And so you can build on that to pull things out. And we have, basically a block in WordPress that just looks for certain tags. You can pull it in. And so adding a related list of articles to the bottom of every article is no problem at all. And doesn't require any maintenance as long as we make sure we continue to tag and categorize things as we publish them. But if you have a tool and it doesn't have that kind of thing built into it, then you are going to be sad, over time. And I'm a little bit, I'll be honest, down on wikis. Wikis, they're great in their way, but they're not for long-term maintenance of a thing. They're limited. They're quite limited in the way that you can use them. They're limited in the kinds of tools that they give you to report on things, to understand everything. So I would be cautious about just relying on a simple wiki. That might not be the best plan in my experience. People love to start a wiki. Everyone loves to start a wiki. There's a reason Wikipedia has a team of people who have greater responsibility for looking and curating and things. It's because if you don't have that human overview of what's going on, it can pretty rapidly get messy. But
I can agree on that. So I also have one question from my side, actually. So just a little bit background. We switched our version control system, and we thought, hey, we are smart now. We write everything in the documentation, keep it simple, write it there, and everything like that. So we had all the things the user need to written in documentation. We focused on the user and everything like that. The biggest problem we were facing is actually we still got message bombed because nobody actually read the documentation, although we pinpointed it out all the time. So is there a process which you can recommend besides actually pointing to the documentation all the time, like read the fine manual thing approach? Or do you have any other suggestion on how to best handle that?
I think you're not alone. Everyone has this problem, first of all. One of my favorite conference talks from Write the Docs was the one where he was like, okay, so someone has this problem, let's Google this problem. And they go Google the problem, and it's a whole list of results. And he says, so we've got Stack Overflow, we've got this, we've got that, we've got the other thing. What are all of these things? Not your docs, right? So people are going to search. So certainly if you have documentation and you want people to be using it, make sure it is publicly available, that it is being indexed by Google, that there is no authentication to just look at the documentation unless there's something sensitive. Because if you don't have that, then the most automatic behavior, which is just going and Googling a thing, isn't going to work for people in finding your documentation. And that means also you need to make sure that you have paid some attention to your search engine optimization and accessibility and those things that Google uses to make sure it prioritizes search results. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I don't know, when I do training, I don't have a training manual that is separate from the documentation. The training relies on the documentation. There shouldn't be multiple things. If you have a service, team, people who are providing direct customer service, those people need to have access to contribute to and your documentation as well, because they are the people who have the direct access to the user. They therefore know what the user is asking. They know what the user needs to know. And if you don't incorporate them into the team of contributors for your primary knowledge resource, then what they are doing is creating a Word doc that they keep on their desktop and then email to people in times of stress. So it's just a matter of making sure that not only you as a developer potentially are on the page of here's our documentation, but everybody who is, especially the people who are supporting users, if it's not you, depending on the size of your project, depending on your company, if it's not you, those people also need to be a real part of the documentarian team, because they're the ones who actually have a little more influence maybe sometimes than you do on who's going to the documentation, what resources people are going to. That's a few things anyway.
I agree. And I think the aspect with Google is quite an interesting one. We did not thought about that, because that can maybe change everything. But as we also see with Confluence, the possibility to search something is not always that great, because I never found anything in Confluence with the integrated search. So
you're not alone. Everyone has this problem with Confluence, but you can apply external search engines like Funnelback, like search blocks, like any of those other things. You can use them with Confluence, and it makes a huge difference.
okay,
So that's another tip.
oh, good to know.